Okay, basically the claim that I'm refuting today is today's media is desensitizing children's minds to what happens out in the real world, causing them to act out in ways which are harmful to themselves and others. My opponent's secondary claims, her first one is violence in the media is desensitizing a child's mind to the violence that is occurring outside the home and causing them to be the source of aggression throughout their lives. The secondary claim is children are incapable of distinguishing reality from fiction. And the third one is arrogant behavior is made acceptable by its portrayal in media. My counterclaim to this argument is media does not have the sole responsibility for the desensitization of the child's mind. For the first secondary claim, I want to restate it. It's basically she's saying media violence is responsible for childhood aggression. The author's saying that violence portrayed in the media causes children to demonstrate violent behavior. Jonathan Friedman of the University of Toronto maintains that the scientific evidence simply does not show that watching violence either produces violence in people or desensitizes them to it. Therefore, I do not see the inference where media violence causes children to behave violently. My opponent is also claiming that violence in the media is the source of aggression throughout children's lives. If this were true, the children would never act violently if media violence or the media entirely simply disappeared from their lives. The media honestly wishes that they had this much influence. However, children have acted violently and aggressively long before the media or civilized societies even existed, so this behavior is not a new thing because of the media. Children fought in the schoolyard before the media, and they will continue fighting each other during the media and long after it's gone. So it's a little difficult to pinpoint the root cause of human behavior, in this case child violence, and blame it on violence in the media. I believe it should be rephrased and honestly should be to what extent has childhood violence increased as a result of the media, since the media is somewhat new. I feel like the increase from past media to present media would be easier to measure. Her claim is nearly identical to her proposition, but just uses different words, I feel like, in her secondary claim, her first secondary claim. The only difference between the proposition and the first secondary claim is the part at the end. The proposition says it's harmful to themselves and others, whereas the first secondary claim says it's the source of aggression throughout their lives. And by its, I mean violence in the media. I feel like the author is just trying to kind of shove it down my throat and tell me that violence in the media is desensitizing children's minds instead of explaining how it actually desensitizes children. Alright, my secondary claim that I'm responding to is children are capable of distinguishing reality from fiction. The secondary claim that children are capable of distinguishing reality from fiction, who says that children are capable? This is a claim of value, clearly an opinion. The only support used for this claim was a hypothetical comparison and a personal inference that parents think children can tell the difference, but they can't. None of the information contained in the secondary claim contains any evidence. They're merely personal anecdotes, and therefore it's irrelevant if they are supposed to be proving a claim of fact. My reasoning challenge is children are incapable of distinguishing reality from fiction is a blanketed statement by the author that fails to explain the relationships between violence in the media and violence in children. Although some researchers may agree from a fundamental standpoint that exposing young children to violence can be somewhat desensitizing, there's no evidence or cases that show that if a child sees violent behavior or television or plays it in a video game, that he or she will practice it out in the real world. So if children are not robbing pimps or stabbing hoes in real life like they are in Grand Theft Auto, then that must mean that children are capable of being able to distinguish reality from fiction, since what they perceive in the fictional world is not what they act or perceive life to be in the real world. All kids make mistakes, but it does not mean that they are incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. With the growing number of violent video games, if children cannot distinguish between the fiction in the violent video games and reality, then there would certainly be an upsurge in violent juvenile criminal behavior that would be able to measure, wouldn't we? According to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Juvenile Violent Crime Index arrest rate increased in 2005 and 2006, and then declined through 2009, its lowest level of a 30-year period. The rate in 2009 was 11% below its 1980 level and 47% below the peak in 1984. And with this decrease, as crime has been decreasing, the amount of video games and video game sales have been increasing during that year, Call of Duty was made Game of the Year and sold more copies than any other video game pretty much combined. So the correlation between crime and violence in children versus the media is kind of going opposite directions. In 2009, there were 262 arrests for violent crime index offenses for every 100,000 youth between 10 and 17 years of age. And each of these arrests involved a different juvenile, which is highly unlikely, though, that no more than 1 in every 382 persons ages 10 to 17 were arrested for violent crime index offenses in 2008, or less than 1/3 of 1% of all juveniles aged 10 to 17 living in the U.S. So that's a very small percentage. My third secondary claim that I'm responding to is arrogant behavior is made acceptable by its portrayal by the media. For example, and this was Miley Cyrus' picture smoking a bong. I've said, how is Miley Cyrus' picture of her smoking a bong arrogant behavior? She obviously did not take the picture herself or ask that it be put on the news, so I don't feel like she's personally trying to go out and be flamboyant about her illegal substance abuse to the world. Arrogance is a normal behavior of human being. Smoking marijuana out of a bong, especially in the state of California, is actually legal. In terms of the legal consequences imposed on California residents caught with unlawful possession, is merely an infraction and is not construed as evidence. Like in comparison to consuming alcohol, I don't think that's not necessarily that big of a crime to be construed as arrogance. I feel that maybe the reporter who maybe reported that found it as arrogant, but I do not. I'll agree that celebrities get away with illegal behavior that normal people would not. However, to attribute the act of arrogance in children as a result of the media is just irrational. It's like diagnosing a child with postpartum depression just because they watched 7 Pounds for the first time. You can't really attribute the behavior of a human being just for seeing something on TV one time. I understand that it may have influence to a certain extent, but it does not. In no way, media is not does not have the sole responsibility for imposing violence on children. Okay, so in conclusion, I do not think that the media has the sole responsibility for the desensitization of a child's mindset as to what happens in the real world. It may have influence to a certain extent, as does anything, but it's not responsible.
Okay, I got to make it quick. Most of the arguments that you make are fine. I think that you've got some good evidence on a couple of the points. The main problem with the presentation is it sounds like an essay, not a speech. You're reading out something that's almost, part of the problem is that the original claim had some convoluted points. The original proposition is, holy criminy, way too long, and the first secondary claim is equally long, and so it gets a little complicated. But you kind of follow up by responding in the same manner with too much verbiage, too much language. Get to the point and be pretty simple. You're making a sweeping generalization here that the evidence doesn't prove. Let me show you, that here's the only evidence that you've got on this point. That's a hasty generalization. Here are substantial exceptions to it, and your conclusion is not valid. Everything else is just yak, 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 yak. Get to the point. All right.